Are we headed for an economic recession? Is the U.S. economy on the brink of recession? Sure seems like the media is wishing for one. Why are so many people obsessed with predicting an near imminent economic collapse? Paul, I'm not sure if you've looked at any of the headlines recently, but it sure seems
Oh,
like
yes.
pretty much for the last 18, maybe more months, somebody somewhere, whether it's the Financial Times or the Wall Street Journal or Market Watch or wherever you might go, they're telling you we are on the brink of recession. Have you seen those headlines?
I have absolutely. And I don't know if it's actually technically possible to be on the brink of something for 18 months running, but that seems to be where we are for sure.
Yeah, that's right. So listen, media outlets are obsessed with predicting this kind of economic collapse. If you went over the course of the last 18 months or so, particularly as we moved out of the COVID reaction, right? Of course, we shut down the economy, understandably, in reaction to a global pandemic, unprecedented times. And then we turned it back on. And then we did a lot of really smart policy things, which we injected a lot of money into the system. We kept people whole. We tried to help small businesses. And then subsequently, we've made a lot of investments, just tremendous investments to keep this going. And it turns out the economy is humming. We've never grown faster. We have lower unemployment than we've had in 40 years. We've created more jobs in a shorter period of time than on record. So it's ought to be good news. At least that's what we think. But simultaneous to all of that, these headlines are just blaring out at you. There's one recently this week from Reuters. Weak retail sales, manufacturing output point to slowing U.S. economy. I was looking at a piece here in Market Watch. The U.S. economy is headed towards a recession, at least according to the leading economic indicators. And so these kind of headlines, you could have been reading this 6 months ago, 10 months ago, 1 year ago, 18 months ago. This has been this imminent recession. Paul, what do you think is going on here?
Well, let me see. I worked as a journalist for many years, and there is some truth to the old axiom: if it bleeds, it leads. Right? Like you want a negative headline always gets more eyeballs than a positive headline. And that's just basic media. Media 101 is you're looking for something. You want to make people feel a little bit imperiled because they're more likely to read the article to find out what they can do to avoid this terrible disaster heading their way. And also some of it has to do with economic literacy of reporters. They don't know exactly all of the things that they're talking about, so they consult an expert. And a lot of economic experts are inclined to come from a more sort of trickle down frame, right? So there are lots of signs, as you said, that are more positive for the economy, right? Like we have seen higher wage growth on the lower end of the spectrum than at virtually any point in U.S. history. Black unemployment is lower than it's been in living memory. These things are all great news, but those aren't the numbers that high-paid economists at banks and Wall Street firms, the kind of people who reporters reach out to for information, uh, they don't especially. Maybe it's a little crass to say, but they don't really care about how the lower wage of the income, the lower end of the income spectrum is doing. They care more about how their bottom lines are and how the economy is working out for the people at the very top. And so they're coming from a very trickle downy perspective.
Yeah, I think this is one of these places where this kind of neoliberalism and trickle down thinking is so prominent across all of journalism, not just economic journalists. In fact, some of them might even be better, but your general journalists, the ones who are producing the headlines that find their way into a lot of the stories we're referencing, those folks, they just don't really understand how a modern economy works. They're really trapped in this old line of thinking, and they genuinely think what's good for workers cannot be good for the economy. You see over and over again things like wages are up. Uh-oh, that's bad for inflation. Or we're adding too many jobs. I mean, there's literally headlines that say we put too many jobs. That's bad for the economy. And there's a lot of speculation out there. You're referencing exactly the people who are speculating, which are most of these economists that they get quoted. They actually work for a bank or a Wall Street firm of some sort, or maybe an academic institution, which is conveniently funded by a billionaire hedge fund guy. And they're all saying things that are talking down the economy. A big part of the reason is their models tell them this shouldn't be happening. When you pay higher wages to workers, that should hurt the economy. That's literally the outputs that their models say. So something has really gone wrong here, where the Biden administration, these big investments, rising wages, tight employment, all of that messes with their models, because their models are based on a lot of erroneous assumptions. When they pump that into their models, it's supposed to spit out recession. And even the Fed has been struggling with getting inflation down, partially because they only have this one dumb tool they're using, which is to increase interest rates. And they're flummoxed as to how it could possibly be that people are still working. They're trying their darndest to make it so that you're not working. But part of that is because they don't understand how a modern economy works, which is the good news is we put a lot of money and resilience into the economy to hold people through this terrible period we had under the COVID. And that means that people had savings and they had bargaining power with their employers so that they were able to get better wages. So between their savings and better wages, they've been held pretty whole through this. And guess what? When you put hundreds of millions of billions of dollars into hundreds of millions of workers' pockets, they spend it in the economy, and that's good. So in other words, we've got a bit of a flywheel effect. And boy, the Fed and others are trying their darndest to break it, and they keep talking about it, trying to talk us into a recession.
Yeah, and then you get this sort of negative feedback loop. Another metric that reporters love to refer to is consumer sentiment, right? They say that consumers feel like a recession is coming. Well, of course, they're going to feel like a recession is coming if every headline is telling them that a recession is coming, right? And if the economists, the people who are experts, are telling them that that a recession is imminent, of course, consumer sentiment is going to be down. So, these things like asking people how they feel about the economy has always been a terrible way to measure the economy, right? Like we've seen this with the minimum wage. Before the minimum wage goes up in an area, there is always a survey of business owners, and they always say, well, if the minimum wage goes up, we're going to have to lay people off and close locations and things like that. And that's how they feel. That is genuinely what they are worried about is going to happen. And it never happens that way, right? But every time a minimum wage goes up, like clockwork, you will see a consumer sentiment survey of business owners. And so this is sort of the same thing, where you have survey people calling people's cell phones and asking them if they think a recession is coming. And of course they do, because they just saw 3 headlines on CNN in the last day saying that a recession is just around the corner, ready to pounce on us.
Yeah, one of the other things that's gone on with consumer sentiment, which is actually a big change in the last 20 years or so, is it's become very tightly interwound with politics, particularly partisan politics. You can see it. Go and look up these numbers. When the president is a Republican, Republicans say the economy's doing well, and Democrats say it's not doing well. And then literally the week that you make a switch, so the week that Obama left office because he had finished his term and that Trump was elected, the switch in consumer sentiment was flipped for Republicans and Democrats. Similarly, to be clear, this is not just a Republican phenomenon. When Trump was in office and then was unelected and Biden became elected, there was an equal flip where Democrats went from saying the economy was terrible to the economy is excellent. And so in other words, when this sentiment is so tied to nothing that has anything to do with your economic circumstances, but it only has to do with the partisan makeup of the presidency, it suggests that there's a lot of other things going on here than actual sentiment about the economy. The second thing that I think is really important is when you ask these surveys, it's exactly as Paul was saying, they are reflecting a lot of what they read in the headlines. But when you ask them about their own financial circumstances, people feel pretty good about their own financial circumstances. And there's good reason for that. They're employed. They have a lot of power with their employment. They've been able to negotiate a higher wage. They likely have savings that were carried over from all of the COVID relief, and they're watching growth in their community. Jobs are growing, cranes are up, buildings are happening, all the rest. Don't get us wrong. There's plenty of things wrong with the economy, and we've got a long way to go. But this disjunct between how my personal economy is doing, how my household economy is doing, and my assessment of the country's economy, there's a big gap there. And that big gap partially is explained by all these explainers telling you that the state of the national economy is terrible, even though you think your own economic circumstance are. What do you think here, Paul? Do you imagine a world in which we have an economy circumstance where this is good for workers and thus people think it's good for the economy? How close do you think we are on that?
I mean, I think we're a lot closer than we were 10 years ago, even 5 years ago. I think that more and more people understand that when, 100 million Americans are making more than they were 2 years ago, that's going to create jobs because they're buying things, as opposed to when 100 billionaires are suddenly making more than they were 2 years ago. They can only buy so many pairs of pants. You can only buy so many super yachts, and so I think that people are starting to grasp this understanding of this middle out economics, how the economy actually works. But it's always going to take the institutions, the educational institutions, time to adjust to this new understanding of how the economy actually works. So, unfortunately, patience isn't going to help in this short term where we're sort of like trying to panic. It seems like we're trying to panic ourselves into a recession.
Yeah.
So, Zach, I think we've done a lot of talking about what the media is doing wrong. I think we want people to know what they should be looking at when they're measuring the economy, because recessions do happen and the economy does go up and down. And so there's got to be some measurements that we want to pay attention to when we're addressing the economy and, planning on whether we're going to buy a house next year or that. So what do you think really matters when it comes to ordinary people looking at the economic factors?
Yeah, totally. That's a great question, Paul. I mean, most importantly, be careful of these headlines. As Paul pointed out, headlines are designed to get you to click and read and share, and they're often really misleading. So that's number one. The second thing is be real careful about watching the stock market. So much of our media is driven by watching the stock market. That is not the real economy. I think famously, somebody had pointed out that it's more of a mood ring for the rich than it is an actual reflection of the real economy. Okay, so those two things you need to be careful about. The things that we really care about, first and foremost, is employment and jobs. We want to be creating jobs and we want people employed. So we want low unemployment and we want to create ample jobs. Big part of the reason for that, to be clear, is to give you bargaining power. Part of the reason that we see wages rising for the bottom 50% for the first time in nearly 20, 30 years is because they finally have bargaining power. That means that they can say, hey, either you pay me more or I'm going to go and find another job. And that is really good. So we want to see very tight labor market. We want to see jobs growing. So that's very important. And then when we want to see really fundamentally, we want to see wages and incomes rising. Ultimately, we, of course, want wages and incomes rising faster than inflation. The thing that we have been experiencing, of course, is very high inflation, and that has eaten into people's wages. Their wages have been climbing, but inflation has been climbing too. What we're hoping to see is inflation declining and your wages still climbing. That would be ideal because then you're making real money and you're able to spend it in your community and invest in your family. So those are some of the things we want to be looking at: creating jobs, keeping unemployment low. That gives workers power. And then we want to make sure that your wages are rising. And finally, of course, we want to see costs coming down. We want to see inflation down, and we want to tackle the big costs in your life. And that means that we need to figure out housing, of course, healthcare, education. Those are some of the big drivers of costs in your life. And if you're talking to a policymaker, we want policymakers focused on those things: create jobs, tight labor markets, higher wages and incomes for people, and then cutting costs in your life. That's a pretty simple platform. We hope that that's what people will do. But anyway, those are the things you should be paying very careful attention to.